In the heart of the galaxy, where the stars shone brighter and civilizations thrived in ways unimaginable, the Caliph Empire stood as a towering force. Advanced beyond measure, they were a race of elegance, power, and superiority. The Caliph had conquered worlds, bent species to their will, and in their arrogance, they viewed other life forms as mere curiosities. Humans, in particular, were nothing more than amusing pets to be owned and displayed by the wealthy elite. Among the Caliph, Princess Zephyra, daughter of the Emperor, was known for her insatiable curiosity and love for exotic creatures. Her collection was the envy of the court, with creatures from the farthest reaches of the galaxy, each more unusual than the last. Yet none of them truly fascinated her. They were all beautiful but predictable. Her heart yearned for something different, something unique. It was during one of her usual strolls through the Imperial archives that she came across the tales of a race called humans, beings with short lifespans, yet full of resilience, emotions, and, as the record stated, the potential for unexpected brilliance. Intrigued by these tales, Zephyra made a decision. She wanted a human, a living, breathing specimen to study, to own, and perhaps to understand. Her wish, as was the custom in the Empire, was not to be denied. The Emperor himself ordered his agents to scour the outer colonies, where the remnants of humanity had settled after the wars that had ravaged their home planets. The search was swift, and soon, they found James Carter, a man who had once been a soldier, a protector of his people, now living a quiet life on a distant colony. James Carter had known peace for only a few years. The wars had taken their toll, leaving scars that were more than just skin deep. He had fought for freedom, for the right to live without fear, and had seen too many lives lost in the process. Now, he cherished the quiet moments, the simplicity of a life away from conflict. But that peace was shattered the day the Caliph came. They took him without warning, their technology far beyond anything he could have resisted. He was no longer a man, he was a possession, a pet, destined for the golden cages of the Caliph Palace. When he was brought before Princess Zephyra, James felt a mix of anger, confusion, and defiance. But he knew better than to show it. In this alien world, far from everything familiar, he needed to bide his time, to understand his captors before making any move. Zephyra, on the other hand, was fascinated by the human standing before her. She had expected a creature, something less than her, something that would cower and obey. But what she saw in James's eyes was not fear, it was something else, something she couldn't quite place. Their first interactions were cautious, almost like a dance where both partners were trying to learn the steps. Zephyra treated him as she would any of her other pets, but James's calm demeanor and piercing gaze unsettled her. He was compliant, yes, but there was an intelligence in his actions, a sharpness in his responses that made her realize this was no ordinary pet. This human, despite his situation, was observing, learning, and perhaps, even planning. James, while playing the role expected of him, was far from passive. Every day, he learned more about the Caliph, how they moved, how they communicated, their customs, and most importantly, their weaknesses. The palace, with its grandeur and opulence, was a gilded cage, not just for him but for everyone within it, including Zephyra. He noticed the subtle tensions among the servants, the way the guards looked away when they thought no one was watching, and the way Zephyra's smile never quite reached her eyes. There was more to this empire than its shimmering surface, and James intended to find out what lay beneath. As days turned into weeks, a strange bond began to form between Zephyra and James. It was not one of master and pet, but something more complex. Zephyra found herself drawn to James, not just as a curiosity, but as someone who challenged her perceptions. He spoke to her of freedom, of the human spirit, of wars fought not for power, but for the right to exist. His words were simple, yet they carried weight, making her question the very foundation of her world. And though she didn't realize it yet, James was becoming more than just a pet. He was becoming her mentor, her guide to a reality beyond the glittering walls of the Caliph Palace. James, meanwhile, kept his emotions in check, his mind focused on the long game. He knew he was in a dangerous position, but he also saw an opportunity. Zephyra, with all her power and privilege, was naive in many ways, but she was also curious, open to new ideas. If he could earn her trust, perhaps he could turn his captivity into something more, something that could change the fate of not just himself, but potentially all of humanity. But for now, he would continue to play the part, knowing that every day brought him closer to understanding the true nature of the Caliph Empire and his place within it. James had always been a strategist, a man who could see 10 moves ahead even in the heat of battle. Now, in the heart of the Caliph Empire, surrounded by advanced technology and a culture that saw him as nothing more than a curiosity, he knew he had to use every skill he possessed to survive. The palace, with its opulence and grandeur, was not just a prison, it was a battlefield of a different kind, one where the rules were unwritten but the stakes were higher than ever. From the moment he was brought to the palace, James began to study his surroundings with the meticulous eye of a soldier. He noted the layout of the halls, the placement of the guards, the routines of the palace staff. The Caliph were advanced, their technology far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered, but they were also complacent, confident in their superiority. That confidence was their weakness, and James intended to exploit it. He quickly learned that the Caliph's security systems, though formidable, were predictable. Their routines were precise, almost mechanical, leaving little room for improvisation. James saw opportunities in those patterns, gaps in their defenses, moments when the palace's vigilance wavered. He also took note of their technology, understanding its strengths and limitations. The Caliph had mastered energy weapons, shields, and surveillance, but their reliance on technology had made them overlook the potential of human ingenuity and adaptability. As James assessed the palace, he also began to study Zephyra. The princess was curious and intelligent, but she had lived her entire life in a bubble of privilege and power. She knew little of the world beyond the palace walls, and even less about the struggles of those who were not Caliph. James saw in her a potential ally, someone who could be swayed, not through force, but through ideas. He knew that if he could plant the seeds of doubt in her mind, if he could make her question the world she took for granted, he might be able to turn her to his cause. James started subtly, sharing stories of his life, of the wars that had ravaged his home, of the sacrifices made by those who fought not for glory, but for survival. He spoke of the values that had driven humanity: freedom, equality, the belief that every individual had the right to choose their own path. These were ideas that were foreign to the Caliph, who lived in a rigid hierarchy where one's place was determined by birth and power. But as Zephyra listened, something in her began to shift. The more James spoke, the more she realized how little she truly knew about the galaxy beyond her empire. Zephyra's fascination with James grew with each passing day. She had expected a simple creature, a pet to entertain her, but what she found was a man of depth and complexity, someone who challenged her in ways she had never imagined. His resilience, his refusal to be broken by his circumstances, intrigued her. She began to see him not as a possession, but as a person, someone who had lived through experiences she could scarcely comprehend. The ideas he introduced, of freedom, of equality, were radical, even dangerous, in the context of the Caliph Empire, but they resonated with her on a level she couldn't fully explain. As they spent more time together, a bond began to form between them. It was not immediate, nor was it simple, but it was real. James knew he had to be careful. Trust was a delicate thing, especially in a place like the Caliph Palace. He couldn't afford to push too hard or reveal too much too soon. Instead, he guided Zephyra gently, leading her to her own conclusions rather than forcing his views upon her. He became more than just a pet in her eyes. He became a mentor, an advisor, someone she could confide in. The more they talked, the more Zephyra began to question the world she had always accepted as the natural order of things. She saw the injustices that James spoke of in her own empire, the way the Caliph treated other species, the way power was concentrated in the hands of a few, the way her own people lived in ignorance of the suffering beyond their borders. These realizations troubled her, but they also opened her eyes to a new way of thinking, one that was in stark contrast to everything she had been taught. Through this cultural exchange, Zephyra began to transform. She was no longer the naive princess who viewed the galaxy through the lens of callous superiority. She started to see the cracks in the Empire's facade, the flaws in its systems, the rot beneath its glittering surface. And with that awareness came a sense of responsibility. She knew that change would not come easily, and that it would be met with resistance, but she also knew that she could not remain silent. The values that James had introduced to her, values of freedom, of justice, of equality, had taken root in her heart, and she could not turn away from them. James watched this transformation with a mix of hope and caution. He knew that Zephyra's journey was just beginning, and that the road ahead would be fraught with dangers. But he also knew that he had found a true ally in her, someone who could help him navigate the treacherous waters of the Caliph court. Together, they were laying the groundwork for something greater than either of them could have imagined, something that had the potential to change not just the Caliph Empire, but the entire galaxy. As James continued to navigate the complex and often dangerous world of the Caliph Palace, his sharp instincts and military training led him to a disturbing discovery. Beneath the glittering facade of the Empire, there was a dark undercurrent of discontent. Whispers in the shadows, veiled conversations, and subtle power shifts pointed to a conspiracy brewing within the highest ranks of the Caliph leadership. It became clear to James that this was more than just palace intrigue. It was a calculated plot to overthrow the Emperor himself, and Zephyra was at the center of it. The conspirators were powerful figures, those who had grown resentful of the Emperor's rule and sought to use the young princess as a pawn in their game of power. Their plan was insidious: destabilize the Empire from within, incite chaos, and then seize control under the guise of restoring order. The repercussions would be devastating, plunging the galaxy into war, tearing apart the very fabric of Caliph society. Zephyra, with her growing influence and potential as a future ruler, was the key to their plans. If they could manipulate her, they could manipulate the Empire. For James, this discovery brought him face to face with a profound dilemma. He had been taken from his home, stripped of his freedom, and forced into a life of servitude. The Caliph Empire had been nothing but a symbol of oppression to him. Yet, in Zephyra, he had found something different, a spark of humanity, a glimmer of hope for a better future. She was not like the others, and her innocence in the face of such treachery stirred something within him. James was torn between his desire to see the Empire fall and his growing responsibility to protect Zephyra, who had come to see him not as a pet, but as a trusted confidant. The weight of the decision was heavy, but James knew he couldn't allow the Empire to descend into chaos, especially if it meant sacrificing Zephyra to the ambitions of ruthless conspirators. His course was clear: he would protect her, even if it meant revealing the full extent of his abilities, skills he had kept hidden until now. The time for subtlety had passed. Action was required, swift and decisive. In the dead of night, when the palace was at its quietest, the conspirators made their move, thinking themselves unseen. But James was ready. His senses honed by years of combat, he intercepted them with precision. What they expected to be a simple abduction turned into a swift and brutal takedown. James moved with the lethal grace of a seasoned warrior, neutralizing threats with an efficiency that left the conspirators reeling. By the time the palace guards arrived, it was over. James stood over the subdued conspirators, his expression calm but his message clear. He was not to be underestimated. Zephyra, having witnessed the entire ordeal, was stunned. She had always known there was more to James than met the eye, but the sight of him in action, defending her with such ferocity and skill, shattered any lingering notion that he was just a pet. In that moment she saw him for what he truly was: a protector, a strategist, and an equal. The dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. The power that the Caliph thought they held over James was gone, replaced by a mutual respect that transcended their previous roles. But the danger was far from over. James and Zephyra both knew that this was just the beginning. The conspiracy ran deep, and there were others in the palace who would not hesitate to strike again. They needed allies, people within the palace who could be trusted, who shared their vision of a future free from the grip of corruption and tyranny. Together, they began to gather information, carefully identifying those who might be sympathetic to their cause. It was a delicate operation. Trust was a rare commodity in the Caliph court, where betrayal was a common currency. But through discreet conversations and quiet observations, James and Zephyra slowly built a network of loyal supporters. These were individuals who had grown disillusioned with the current regime, who longed for change, but had been too fearful to act alone. With James's guidance and Zephyra's influence, they began to coalesce into a small but formidable group, united by a common goal: to protect the Empire from the shadows that threatened to consume it. As their plans took shape, James found himself in a position he had never anticipated, leading a resistance within the very heart of the Empire that had once enslaved him. It was a dangerous game, one where the stakes were nothing less than the future of an entire civilization. But with Zephyra by his side, a young princess who was quickly becoming a force in her own right, James knew they had a chance. Together, they were more than just an unlikely alliance. They were a beacon of hope in a galaxy on the brink of darkness. As the day of reckoning approached, Zephyra found herself caught in a web of emotions and conflicting loyalties. The values James had introduced her to, freedom, justice, equality, had taken root in her heart, challenging everything she had been taught from birth. The weight of her family's legacy, the expectations of the Empire, and the love she bore for her father clashed with the new ideals she had come to believe in. She was no longer the sheltered princess content to observe the world from within the palace walls. She was someone who had seen the cracks in the Empire's foundation, and she knew they could no longer be ignored. Every conversation with James had chipped away at the carefully constructed reality she had lived in. His stories of human struggles, his unwavering belief in the right to self-determination, and his courage in the face of overwhelming odds had opened her eyes to the injustices that permeated the Caliph Empire. Yet the idea of turning against her own family, of betraying the father who had raised her, filled her with dread. The burden of choice weighed heavily on her shoulders, knowing that whichever path she chose would shape the future of the Empire and her place within it. When the day finally came, it arrived like a storm. The conspirators, confident in their plans, launched their coup with brutal efficiency. The palace, once a symbol of unassailable power, was thrown into chaos. Zephyra's world was upended as the walls that had protected her crumbled under the force of treachery from within. Servants fled, guards fought desperately to maintain order, and the air was thick with the tension of an empire on the brink of collapse. Amidst the turmoil, James and Zephyra moved swiftly, their bond forged in trust and shared purpose. James's military training and strategic mind were invaluable, but it was Zephyra's intimate knowledge of the palace and the intricacies of Caliph politics that gave them an edge. Together, they navigated the treacherous halls, outmaneuvering the conspirators at every turn. They knew the stakes. If the coup succeeded, the empire would fall into the hands of those who would rule with cruelty and oppression, plunging the galaxy into an era of darkness. As they approached the heart of the conspiracy, Zephyra's inner conflict intensified. The leader of the coup, a trusted advisor of the emperor, confronted them, his words dripping with contempt for the ideals James had instilled in her. He painted a picture of an empire restored to its former glory through strength and control, dismissing the values of freedom and equality as weaknesses. Zephyra could see the future he envisioned, a future where the Caliph Empire would reign supreme, crushing any who dared oppose it, including those who sought to change it from within. But as the confrontation reached its peak, Zephyra realized that she could no longer stand idly by. The teachings of James, the truths he had shown her, and the courage he had demonstrated in the face of impossible odds crystallized into a resolve she had never felt before. This was not just about saving her father or preserving the empire as it was. It was about choosing the kind of ruler she wanted to be, the kind of empire she wanted to leave behind. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. With a clarity of purpose, Zephyra made her choice. She stood beside James, not as a dutiful daughter of the empire, but as a leader who had embraced the ideals of justice and freedom. Together, they faced the conspirators in a final, dramatic showdown. The battle was fierce, a clash of wills and weapons, but in the end, it was Zephyra's resolve and James's unyielding determination that turned the tide. The conspirators, shocked by the princess's defiance and the strength of her alliance with the human they had underestimated, faltered, and were ultimately defeated. The palace, though scarred by the conflict, remained standing, as did the empire. But it was an empire forever changed by the events that had unfolded. Zephyra's decision to side with James sent shockwaves through the court. The daughter of the emperor, once seen as a symbol of Caliph tradition, had chosen to align herself with the very ideals that threatened to dismantle the old ways. Her choice was met with disbelief, anger, and, in some quarters, admiration. As the dust settled, it became clear that Zephyra was no longer a mere princess. She was a force of change, a leader who would not be swayed by the conventions of the past. Her decision to save her father and the empire from the conspirators had not only preserved the throne but also set the stage for a new era. She had demonstrated a strength that went beyond physical power, a strength of character and conviction that would shape the future of the Caliph Empire. In the aftermath, James remained by her side, no longer just a protector but an advisor and partner in the challenging journey ahead. They both knew that the battle was far from over. The empire needed to be reformed, the old ways needed to be questioned, and the values of freedom and equality needed to be woven into the fabric of Caliph society. But they also knew that together, they had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by the bond they had forged in the fires of conflict. The coup had been crushed, but the Caliph Empire was left trembling in its wake. The grandeur of the palace, once a symbol of unyielding power, now seemed fragile, its walls echoing with the silence that followed the chaos. The conspirators, once confident in their plan to seize control, had been defeated, their ambitions shattered. But the cost was evident. Trust had been eroded, and the empire's foundation, once thought indestructible, now showed cracks that could no longer be ignored. Zephyra stood at the center of it all, no longer the naive princess sheltered by the opulence of the palace, but a leader who had faced treachery head-on and emerged stronger. The events that had unfolded left no doubt. Zephyra had proven herself, not just as a ruler by birth, but as one by choice and conviction. The court, once divided, now looked to her with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, sensing the winds of change that she embodied. In the aftermath, with the conspirators dealt with, Zephyra knew that the time for action had come. The old ways had been exposed for what they were: oppressive, unjust, and unsustainable. The empire could not continue on its current path, not if it was to survive the challenges ahead. Standing before the assembled court, Zephyra made a declaration that would reverberate across the galaxy. With a voice steady and clear, she announced her intention to reform the Caliph Empire, beginning with the abolition of the practice that had long been a stain on their civilization: the keeping of humans and other species as pets. The shock that rippled through the court was palpable. This was more than just a policy change. It was a dismantling of a tradition that had been ingrained in the Caliph for generations. But Zephyra spoke with a conviction that left no room for doubt. She had seen firsthand the strength, the intelligence, and the spirit of the beings they had once deemed inferior. To continue treating them as mere possessions was not only wrong, it was a threat to the very ideals she now sought to uphold. The old ways, she declared, would be replaced by a new era of equality and respect for all life, regardless of its origin. James stood by her side, his presence a testament to the truth of her words. He was no longer just a survivor of the Empire's cruelty, he was now a symbol of the change Zephyra was bringing about. His role as her advisor was not one of subservience, but of partnership. He guided her through the complexities of politics, helped her navigate the resistance she would inevitably face, and offered his perspective on how to implement the reforms that would transform the Caliph Empire. Together, they were forging a path that would challenge the very fabric of their society, but it was a path they knew was necessary. The journey ahead was daunting. The Empire's prejudices ran deep, and there were those who would resist the changes with every ounce of their being. But Zephyra and James were undeterred. They understood that true change was never easy, and that it required not just courage, but persistence and vision. They would face opposition, both from within the palace and beyond, but they also knew that they were not alone. The allies they had gathered, those who believed in the new vision for the Empire, stood ready to support them, to fight for a future where all beings could coexist as equals. As they prepared to set out on this journey, Zephyra and James shared a moment of quiet reflection. The road before them was uncertain, fraught with challenges that would test their resolve at every turn. But it was also a road filled with hope, the hope of creating a galaxy where power was not defined by dominance, but by the ability to uplift others, where strength was measured not by control, but by the capacity to foster understanding and unity. Zephyra looked at James, the man who had come into her life as nothing more than a curiosity, and who had become her greatest ally, her mentor, and her friend. In his eyes she saw the strength that had carried him through unimaginable trials, the wisdom that had guided her in moments of doubt, and the resilience that had inspired her to fight for something greater than herself. And in that moment she knew that together they could achieve the impossible. The galaxy awaited them, vast and filled with possibilities. As they stepped forward, they carried with them the promise of a new dawn for the Calith Empire, a future where the past no longer dictated the present, and where the ideals of freedom, equality, and respect for all life would light the way. Their alliance was more than just a partnership, it was a beacon of hope for a civilization on the brink of transformation. And in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a better world, James had become more than just a hero. He was the embodiment of humanity's indomitable spirit, a force that had changed the course of history, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always a path to the light.